All right. After 20 minutes of struggle against whatever technology handicap that I experienced, we're finally here. I'm Samuel Chu. I'm here with Rebecca. Sorry to those of you who are waiting, but we'll jump right in and get started. Thank you for joining us this morning here in Berlin. Actually, we're both in Berlin, and I'm Samuel Chu. I'm the president and founder of the Campaign for Hong Kong. Today, I'm also here as a joint discussion and event hosted by Veto, Rebecca, who's here, who's the founder and director. And I also am here as part of the advisory board of the Axel Springer Freedom Foundation. Just before I turn it over to Rebecca, just a few brief word. The Campaign for Hong Kong is a primarily U.S. based, but we work around the world in specifically telling the story of Hong Kong and the struggle for freedom of Hong Kong around the world and contextualizing it to the different political, historic, and cultural contexts that each and every country represents. We spend our focus is really about giving particular governments and civil society groups actionable information that they can really implement and enact in support of the pro-democracy movement, not just in Hong Kong, but in China, but also working with different dissidents from around the world. Which is why that I have am honored to be a part of this new effort at Axel Springer Freedom Foundation. Our motto at the foundation is let the dissident speak and listen to the dissidents. And I think that that's summarizes, encapsulate what we really believe. And I'm actually sitting here at the Axel Springer headquarters. You might be able to see a small silhouette of the pillar of shame that the foundation brought to Berlin this past week for this month as we lead up to the Tiananmen Square massacre anniversary. This, I think, is a great example of how that the pillar of shame created by Jan Skalshort was originally created to commemorate the Tiananmen Square protester who died in 1989. It was then moved to Hong Kong in 1997 as a way of not just commemorating, but also testing to see the guarantees of freedom and human rights that were made to Hong Kong. The pillar was then removed in December of 2021 by the government, and a few weeks ago was arrested by the Hong Kong police in its investigation against national security crimes. So it is a poignant moment for me in particular, but I think a powerful moment for the foundation to be able to bring this replica of the pillar right here to Berlin. And it's also my distinctive pleasure and honor to introduce Rebecca, who's director of Veto, and I'll let her introduce herself and describe what Veto does and why we're here today.
Thank you. So I also want to thank Antje Schipman, who is the director of the Axel Springer Freedom Foundation and who brought us together. It's her initiative that we're here talking about freedom and the voice of dissidents and also countering state actors who try to interfere in democratic states. Veto is a very small organization, an NGO that educates decision makers, not only politicians, but also other NGOs about the danger to the rule of law and democratic states. And one of the areas we educate people in is interference of state actors in Europe, which became very, very obvious now with the Russian war against Ukraine, but has been there for many years before. So we saw that, for example, Russia killed opposition figures even in Berlin. And we saw their efforts to build up, interfere on various levels, to do lobby work and so on, but also quite aggressive work like threatening people. And all these things we have seen already with China, but haven't paid attention, at least in Europe, not as much as we have to other state actors. So I'm very happy that you take the time to talk with me because you're one of the experts in the field, not only a dissident yourself, but also an expert in the ways China interferes in democratic states. And I just, in preparation for our talk, I listened to various podcasts. I read some of the papers of analysts on China. There are not that many in Europe, but there are quite a few in New Zealand and Malaysia and the United States. and Australia, of course. So it's very interesting to see the different perspectives. And you travel around the world to educate people on China. I mean, the Chinese state, not Chinese people, but the Chinese state. And I wonder what you would say about the differences worldwide and maybe also in Europe. How is the Chinese Communist Party perceived now, and what is the awareness of its actions?
Yeah, so I think you're right that there's actually quite a bit of variety, I would say, in the way in which that I think the Chinese government, in particular the ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, is perceived. Um, just a little bit, take a step back of I think on a more global scale. I think that it is clear that the COVID pandemic over the last 3 years have shifted fundamentally, I think, global view, international view of China, particularly the Chinese government, because as it relates to the way in which that the regional outbreak in Wuhan, how it was handled, the way in which that the Chinese government clearly tried to cover it up in terms of whistleblowers, of reporters and doctors who try to inform and share what was happening on the ground, um, and the way in which that cascaded or the ripple effect of that, I think, have shifted fundamentally the way that the world perceive China. I think that's a more global macro factor that I think we have to kind of keep in mind. The second is that I think the year and a half ago, when the invasion of Ukraine by Russia took place, I think it also, particularly in Europe, brought a new level of tangible concerns and fear that I think it's not just to Russia, but I think extends to other foreign states, in this case, China, who also just happens to have this no limit partnership between Xi Jinping and Putin that I think brings that into much more clear focus. But on a really, I think, local level, on the ground, I would say that European countries generally still has a few steps behind in terms of its perception of China. And I think that has to do with a number of different factors. Compared to US, for example, that the issue of China, may it be its economic growth and competitiveness and unfair practice as it comes to trade and economics, to the crackdown in Hong Kong, the threat to Taiwan, all of these things have, I think, a much more robust discussion around this in the US because it really has been brought to the mainstream of the political discourse and the public discourse. That has not been the case in Europe when I travel around. And I think a number of the factor has to do with the fact that China still feels to some people very, very far away. And as I usually sometimes mention that it's more likely that you meet a China specialist who studies the Chinese language and ancient art than someone who actually are familiar with the current political or economic situation in China. The second is I think that there's a lot of still of the either willful naive thinking of the fact that we can just trade our way with China into changing China and that they would just become less of a threat and more like us if we were to keep doing the economic and reaping the economic benefits. I think that that's a little bit of a naive way of thinking that continue to perpetuate in the Europe. And then finally, to the topic that we're actually have on hand is I think that a lot of it is about how China has been so successful in permeating and penetrating Europe in its influence. Some of it is very obvious. I traveled recently to the countries of like Portugal, which um, a portion of a Chinese government and state-owned firm owns a major stake in their electric company and their power energy company. Um, and then they're sometimes not so subtle, right? That they have documented interference politically and also on civil society and also on a general population level of Chinese influence in countries that both explicitly threaten any kind of criticism or any kind of attempt to hold Chinese government accountable or even discuss Chinese presence on European soil. And then there are just some, I think, a lot of countries in Europe who feels like that they don't want to poke and provoke the PRC because it might lead to maybe a decrease in investment. Maybe they will say to the people in China that stop traveling and stop visiting a certain country in Europe. And I think all of those things are in play. And I think that that has a huge influence as to why there continue to be either a willful naivete, or a sort of subtle ignorance around Chinese influence, and what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do and bring to fruition on not just in China but in a global stage.
You've been cut off a short for a bit, but I think I got most of it. So I looked through some of the strategies, and most researchers seem to categorize, to see four categories where the Chinese state is active and interfering in democratic states, and particularly worldwide. And one is the Belt Road Initiative, which is a synonym of economic pressure. So trying to offer certain states some economic benefits and thereby then setting some of the conditions under which they can take part, for example, using the Chinese system of GPS, using some of the contracts that they propose and so on. So offering something, but then demanding control in return. The second one is strategic communication about the image of China in the world. For example, influencing even the movie industry in the US, pressuring them on creating a positive image of the Chinese Communist Party, trying to interfere in not showing movies where China is portrayed as a malign actor, things like that. So controlling the image of China, controlling media, trying to interfere wherever there's criticism in the public sphere, so trying to influence the public image. Then, of course, efforts to co-opt Western government and companies. For example, also, even in Germany, I heard complaints of CEOs who have been blackmailed, received emails that they had some misconduct in the sexual sphere. Even if that's not true, it's very difficult once those rumors stick then to get out of it and so on. So even on this level, threats. And then controlling the Chinese diaspora. So watching over them, threatening them, and so on. So this seems to be some of the patterns that we see. But I haven't heard about, for example, what both Iran and Russia have been doing, for example, targeted killings of opponents in Western countries from Chinese. I mean, there have been hostage taking, so they held some of other foreign nationals hostages, but there don't seem to be actions that, especially in Europe, draw the attention to the aggressive behavior. So it's more on a subtle level. It's something that you cannot grasp. It's something that you cannot see. You don't see blood on the streets. I mean, of course, there's a threat to Taiwan, and of course, we see blood in China, but it's not close. It doesn't hit close home for Europeans. Do you see any of that? How can we, explain it in a way that the public becomes more aware? What are the examples that you would, name if you talk to decision makers to make them see the problem?
I think that you're exactly right. I think one of the challenge, and I think it's a tension that we have to work through and work with, is that because of the way that these things are reported, we generally only hear about the most sensational cases, right? The ones where the people who are targeted themselves is willing to come out and speak. But we've seen this in the Russia, as you described, the Russian poisoning of dissidents, the targeted assassination of activists or journalists from foreign countries. Those are the ones that we hear about. But I think that China is actually much more strategic in a way. They do not sort of rise to the level. What they do is often in the background, sometimes not very effectively, to be honest, but sometimes, as you say, they utilize these four categories that you laid out in a much more systematic, broad, inclusive way, so that they don't actually have to do sort of the extreme cases. Um, and I think that just to give you some examples, as you were asking about, I think that there are obviously sometimes very high profile disinformation campaigns that happens. So just most recently, you might remember that there was a whole controversy around the Dalai Lama that was raised on social media about a video clip of his interaction with a boy, and the way that happened, right? That's not a. I mean, they're not going to go after the Dalai Lama by trying to assassinate or poison him because they know that that's just going to make it even more powerful in terms of his role and status. But they are using, like what you described, not blackmail per se, but a way of sharing disinformation through the media, through their network, through social media, in a way that would essentially raise some level of doubt or try to take down the reputation. And that is used against not just the Dalai Lama, he's just the most high profile example. But people generally are faced with these accusations or these harassment. And for every Dalai Lama case out there, there are thousands and thousands of others that we never hear about. And I think that that's one example as far as disinformation being used. I think you already talked about the idea that using family member as leverage is a very common tactic for the PRC. Almost every activist I have worked with from the mainland have had this experience where when they do something in the West or talk to a reporter, they go on a forum, or they come to have an event with me in person, almost always their family members in Hong Kong or in China or in wherever they might be in the mainland would immediately get a visit, or even more scary for them is that they would actually get a phone call from their family member to then actually tell them that the police are here and they have told me that you are doing certain thing that threatens or criticizes the government, and so you need to stop because we're going to be the one who will suffer the consequences. And I think that that's a very common tactic that I think you see. And then there are other cases that I think are also egregious. But again, last year my colleagues at Safeguard Defenders published a report that documented over 200 police stations that are being operated by a PRC overseas on foreign soils. And we have been able to, for example, in the Netherlands, connect directly threats made where a phone number that is connected to the police station is used to directly threaten Chinese residents who are living in the Netherlands. And it's also used sometimes to do even more damage, like calling in a fake bomb threat to the Dutch police. And that type of what in the US we kind of call swatting, where someone would say that, oh, look, I'm going to call the police and say that Samuel Chu is coming to the Chinese embassy with a bomb. It's a way of really creating a lot of not just legal challenges and problems, but I think a lot of um, barriers to then for someone to think about. It's like, do I really want to speak out or join this meeting or go to this event if I could potentially face not just my family suffering, me being harassed, but I could be arrested under false charges and pretense on foreign soil. And those are, I think, very difficult things for people to calculate. And then I would just add one more example that I often use is that my arrest warrant is a great example of this. I think that they understand that I'm not going to stop. So by issuing an arrest warrant, I don't think their goal was to say that Samuel is going to stop talking just because we're targeting him. My arrest warrant, I think, is really intended to silence and scare everyone else around me. Not only to send a message to my family and friends and people I'm connected to in Hong Kong to say that if you talk to him, if you connect to him, you speak to him, you will be bringing a target on your back. But also anyone outside who has any kind of economic or personal connection to the mainland China, right? That I have a friend who works in the Hollywood and the entertainment industries who, a few years ago when my arrest warrant was issued, posted on social media about my situation. And exactly a week later, her agent told her that she had been dropped from a project from a major studio. And we will never be able to directly pinpoint and say that that's because of what China pressure to the Hollywood studio. But we know that there was no other explanation. But that's how it works. It's that there's no clear accountability that could be pinpoint. So China can actually exert these kind of influence without ever having to claim responsibility or hold responsibility for what they're actually doing in these interference operations.
Hmm. I have heard reports from managers and CEOs of companies who have absolutely no ties to China, but were recruited on managing projects where Chinese companies were part of bigger international projects. And then all of a sudden, if somebody was very critical or threatened the interests of the Chinese company, these persons then had been reported for sexual harassment at their own company. They received emails with accusations, their employers and other parts, and so on. So it seems that they even use this kind of tactics not only against Chinese dissidents, but also against Westerners. And it's very, very difficult to defend yourself against anonymous accusations, even though they're totally, I mean, there's no ground, no basis for them. But then you have to put a lot of resources into defending yourself against accusations. And of course, for example, sexual harassment is a serious matter. So you have to take it serious if somebody's accused of that. And a lot of them pulled out. So they left their posts. They went to another project and so on and said, well, maybe the next person then will have to deal with that. And then they simply didn't put up an aggressive tone against the Chinese company. And all these things, what I wonder is, I've been told these stories over and over again from different managers, different companies working in international projects, but there's never been a report on any of that. I mean, I heard some of my colleagues that they had been in Geneva and then knocks on the door and late at night with prostitutes in front of the door and people taking pictures when they opened the door, trying to threaten them that they're going to publish these pictures. But I haven't seen reports about these kind of strategies as yet in Western media as naming it a strategy to interfere and influence even.
Yeah.
That was not about politics. That was simply about business interests. Yeah, pressuring people not to, to do certain contracts. Especially in building industries where I worked for a long time, there are always problems with security and also compliance. Yeah, so not to pressure them, not to point out compliance issues with Chinese companies, things like that. It's not so much about bigger politics, but it's even on a small scale in international projects. But still, I haven't heard about these kind of strategic threats in the media. And there seems to be a very big reluctance, even with Western managers, to go out and speak in public, although some of the business corporations did here warn politicians, but even they refrain from, publishing reports and bringing it into the open. So there seems to be a lot of fear. And this seems to be something that is working even with Westerners, although they don't, have family members who will suffer.
Exactly. I think that that is, I think, exactly again the difference between, I think, a lot of the majority of the Chinese pressure and interference campaigns are not done in these kind of sensational assassination plot or once in a while we hear these I think very kind of I would say sort of dramatic movie like cases that. But I think that and going back to my case of the in my arrest warrant, I think when my arrest warrant was announced 2 years ago, I have sought a lot of clarification around what this actually means, right? No one can actually tell me what it actually means. So there are two European countries that has extradition agreements with Hong Kong directly. One is the Czech Republic, one is Portugal. I've been trying very hard to suspend and get them to suspend both, and so I've traveled to both countries. I have a certain sense of like trust that those countries are not going to arrest me on behalf of the Hong Kong government and extradite me. But no one can tell me which country, right, that actually I should be afraid of or stay away from. One of my dear friend, who's also a board member at the Campaign for Hong Kong, is Angela Gui. Her father was a Swedish citizen that was kidnapped by the Chinese government in Thailand 5 years ago, and have since been convicted of crimes and serving a sentence in the mainland now. And but I think the gray area is where they're targeting the sort of sometimes the unspoken, right? They want to make it ambiguous. They want to make sure that they're using these tactics that I think I definitely understand what you're describing in terms of like it is tremendously difficult to separate the truth from and the facts from smearing and accusations that are otherwise motivated, and I think that because of that, China is able to operate in this vast gray area when it comes to individual either business or political dissidents or otherwise, and also on foreign soil, because there's such a big gap of both awareness of the public, the willingness for government to actually step in and act, and any consequences. So if they just spread a rumor, it doesn't work, there's no loss to them because it's not at all pinned on the Chinese government and their operation.
Because you mentioned the kidnapping of your colleague in Thailand and the use of legal instruments to oppress opposition in the West. There's similarities to the Iranian regime, actually, because they used Interpol for a long time, and Russia also did that, to get dissidents arrested and threaten them with being extradited to either Iran or China. For example, the Swedish citizen who has been executed just 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was arrested from Interpol in Poland. And then the Polish court system had to deal with the charges, and they cleared him of all charges. So they didn't extradite him. And then he was kidnapped in Turkey, brought to Iran, and finally executed just a few weeks ago. But then there were no consequences. So it's interesting that this system is now being discussed at the level of the European Commission, that Interpol is being used to interfere with dissidents, to threaten dissidents, but there still seems to be no counter strategy. So especially in this field of this gray area of smearing campaigns and legal instruments, using legal instruments to, misusing them to pressurize people speaking out against the tactics of China. Have there been any concepts, any strategies to counter these tactics?
Well, so I think that you're point out, I think, a good point that there at least there's a silver lining here is that I think the European Union, the European Commission is finally, I think, waking up to the fact that that these kind of operational interference are happening. So the most recent G7 gathering in their communicate after joint communicate that it specifically talks about PRC interference on European soil, which I think is a positive step forward, but I think it's obviously not enough to just acknowledge it. But I do think that there's some growing acceptance or awareness that this is a problem when we have to do something about it. I think that you bring up an interesting point. I have actually so my colleagues, when they did the police station report from Safeguard Defenders, I think really sort of broke a little bit of the blind the blinders, took off from some people of being able to actually articulate and point to that here's a concrete examples of this kind of interference in physical form, and that what you describe as these sort of force removal or force return, someone has to be doing the dirty work of threatening and dragging these people back, and often those are invisible, and I think that's exposing those, I think, are very important. So to your questions about kind of what can be done, I think that you're right that there needs to be much more documented, so just like the police station report that I think got a lot of traction throughout the last 6 months. There needs to be much more detail documented sort of overview and descriptions of the kind of tactic that's being used. I think one of the things that about the police station that really resonated is that I think it offends people in Europe and any country that these police stations are in, that their own national security is being threatened. And there's a sense of national pride, right? That you are operating illegally and interfering in this blatant way. I think we have to appeal to that in terms of what Europeans and European countries feel about their own security, especially in the context of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. I think that that's something that we have to do much better on. I also, when I talk to government about this, there are a few layers of things that I want them to kind of look at. I've spoken to foreign ministry here in Germany, and in France, in the Netherlands, and across Europe. One of the problem that we have is that even in the US, where we have taken very aggressive in the last year steps in prosecuting these bad actors, when they do it, and I have encouraged and pushed for the Department of Justice in the US to, unseal indictments and to make clear, even if the person is no longer in the country, to make sure that they actually publicize about these prosecutions and arrests, it is still not being told in a way that I think resonate with people. Right? There were 2 people just recently that was arrested in the US in New York that are connection to the police station by the PRC in New York. The indictments are like 20 pages and nobody ever reads them. And a year and a half ago, the FBI also arrested people who ranges from trying to a Chinese agent that they concluded was operating under the direction of the PRC, who tried to bribe a tax agency staff to get dirt and information about a Chinese American who was running for Congress. A group that went out to California to physically burn down a statue that was criticizing Xi Jinping and the COVID response by China. People who were physically trying to attack Chinese Americans on American soil. These are stories that are actually, so we have to step up in the actual prosecution and then unveiling and sharing those things in an aggressive way so that people know what they're looking for. People know what might be happening so that people know what is happening to them is not just their own unique experience. That is a very important part. Another important action by state is the connection between different layers of government. You're seeing this now in Canadian government. There's been a rash of disclosure about members of parliament in Canadian parliament that is being targeted by Chinese operations and intimidations and harassment. But as it turns out that there are different pieces of information that are just not shared, right? You have the intelligence services that are probably most equipped to trace and track these kind of direct threats and harassments. But they're generally not necessarily sharing that with foreign ministries or with law enforcement or the Department of Ministry of Justice or Department of Justice, whatever country you're in. And I understand that because historically there's built-in separations and protections and firewall between these departments and ministries that I think are legitimate. But when it comes to this type of foreign interference, they are playing specifically into this weakness of the disconnect between federal intelligence services, local law enforcement, local legislative bodies that are sometimes targeted, and foreign ministries. The Ministry of Justice might not be taking in information and gathering evidence for prosecution that are necessary to really not only expose these kind of operation, but also to actually hold them accountable.
Mm.
Final example of another thing that I talk to governments a lot about is that, like the examples about the false bomb threats that are called in the Netherlands and have happened in a number of isolated cases. That requires not just federal government awareness and capacity to deal with them. It also requires training on local law enforcement, right? It requires you to actually have local law enforcement that understands when someone says that that I just got a bomb threat made in the name of a dissident, that they need to know that the first thing they are to do is not to go to the dissident and arrest them, but to
Mm.
actually know that this is triggering a different kind of investigation than a
Mm.
normal call of a bomb threat would be. And that requires training that I am hoping that we will begin to do more and more of so that there is, again, this realignment from the
Mm.
top level of intelligence services all the way down to local law enforcement, but also an alignment of dissidents, right? You're right that there are a lot of people who are impacted by this, who've been targeted by this, who are just sitting in their own isolated room, office, home, thinking that what can I do? And I think that is the nature of this, is that they are banking on the fact that people are too afraid, don't have enough resources, or too scared to
Mm.
actually step up. And I think that the responsibility should never be on the individual dissidents to fight
Mm.
back. There needs to be some mediating institutions. May it be someone like the Campaign for Hong Kong, may it be other diaspora dissidents communities, but
Mm.
there needs to be a infrastructure put in place to then mediate and interfere, run interference on behalf of individuals who are much more vulnerable than others.
Mm.
For some, that uh, the ones who are most vulnerable are not just the ones who have family members back home. When you have someone who's a new arrival in a country where they have a lack of economic, housing security, where their visa has not been approved permanently, where they're waiting for approval for their asylum or cases, they are in a much more vulnerable position than others. And it is up to people, an organization like ours, to be able to be the mediating force for them. So these are all things that I talk to governments about, talk to civil society about, because those are all the things that needs to work together to be able to actually address these kind of threats and risk.
Mm. Yeah, the infrastructure is a very good point, because I think that is also a lack that we see defending Iranian dissidents here, because they also faced defamation campaigns. They are threatened in cyberspace and on the streets, but they all feel very much alone. So each individual reports the threats, and then the usual response from local law enforcement is hold your head down for a while. So not being a target for a while. And of course they can't do that. Yeah, and that's exactly what should not happen, to force them to shut up. But there's no infrastructure in place as yet, and no big think tank or anything like that to protect them and to help them if they're threatened and defamed and so on, to somehow give them the resources to fight back.
And this is, the way that I have spoken about this extensively, particularly in Europe, is that I think it is unacceptable for dissidents who many have escaped, with barely with their lives, who are some of the most resilient, courageous people who
Mm.
have been imprisoned, who have endured torture, who have endured
Mm.
and had to escape countries, under extreme duress, to arrive at their new country only to live in the same cage and prison as they were before. I think that that is unacceptable, and that for me is a clear, one of the most urgent starting point for European governments to really step up and say that these are some of the most courageous people that we have welcomed into our country. They will not and should not continue to live as prisoners or as second-class citizens in our country.
Yeah, exactly. It's to do with racism as well, to still think that they're somehow subjected to a foreign judicial system, although they fled the system and live here and are still not protected from the reach of those dictatorships. But I want to touch briefly also on propaganda, because we are very aware now about Russia Today has been banned from our channels. We know Al Jazeera is putting out propaganda. We have influencers, but I haven't also heard much about the strategic communication of the Chinese state. I saw a lot of influencers, as we talked about briefly yesterday, saying China is extremely effective. We built factories in 3 days. We have the best railroad system. And nothing works in Europe, especially in Germany. Railroad is a very hot topic. It really doesn't work. So it's very often that you get these messages, see, our system works, yours does not. Has there been some strategic channels? For example, the Iranian regime, which is quite unknown in Europe, is one of the most clicked news resource in South America and in some African states. So they built up news channels, which are not perceived as being Iranian propaganda channels, but putting out normal daily news in local languages. And they're under the top 3 clicked daily news resources in South America. And they slip in here and there some of the propaganda of the Iranian states. They're not so successful in Europe. They have some state channels here, very much like Russia Today, but they're very successful in African states and South America. Is there something similar from the Chinese government? Do they do that kind of propaganda as well? I mean, posing as a news channel and then putting out information and slipping in there here and there some of their propaganda?
Yeah, I think it's a Chinese government does exactly the same thing, and in fact, I think that there are examples of this all around the world where it's not just that they um, and I think that governments and local media company has become much more aware or sensitive to, for example, Chinese propaganda, essentially buying into their way into major platforms. Right? They for a long time would place quote unquote op-eds into newspapers in the U.S., but really it's quote unquote a partnership where they pay for a certain space to feature essentially what they try to portray as independent opinion pieces or
Mm.
news pieces. And so for years, they have done this in a very blatant, open way. They buy off, certain, again, like newspapers or online platform. You will see, as you were describing, they don't just go for, and I think they're smart enough. They know that they don't just go for the major. They don't just go buy ads in the New York Times. They go and penetrate small publications who are looking for content. There are many right now online media that sometimes are proactively looking and paying for content and they're very good at being able to actually place and penetrate those markets. The other thing that I think is important to point out is that, you know, let's say for an average German person, they don't have the categories and the experience and the lens to judge what they're reading, watching, or listening, that if they're propaganda or not.
Mm.
That is part of the problem, right? Because I would constantly run into people and smart people, sophisticated people, people who are actually focused on foreign policy, who would accidentally expound like a talking point from the Hong Kong government because they have heard it somewhere and it sounded, plausible and it makes sense. So they have incorporated it into their own sort of analysis without knowing where it was coming from. And I think that this is not just in traditional media. You see this, there's a very sophisticated disinformation apparatus on social media. I think that the fact that, for example, that um, Twitter is not available in China,
Mm.
but China dominates the way in which that certain topics are discussed and
mm,
certain response are generated when it comes to Twitter discourse. Because
mm,
every diplomat from the Chinese Foreign Ministry has a Twitter account,
mm,
and they have thousands and thousands of bots and people who are essentially job is to amplify Chinese propaganda. And actually, in the last year and a half, they have also used the same network to promulgate Russian talking points. And so I think that it is hard to overestimate. I would say that it's impossible to overestimate the scale in which that this is taking place. So for every, yesterday we finally saw a German language statement from the Chinese embassy in Berlin in
mm,
response to the pillar here at Axel Springer, where they regurgitated the same talking point that they always have, which is that Chinese people are very happy. We're 91% happy and one of the highest in the world. Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan are all internal affairs. Taiwan has never been separate from us. I mean, all the same talking points, right? And you're saying like, well, nobody's gonna buy into this, and that's true. Nobody actually cares about those talking
mm,
points, but that's not what we're actually concerned about. What we're concerned about is somebody picking out some parts of this and saying that, oh, like I heard this from a YouTube video, and it subconsciously becomes part of the narrative. And specifically, when you combine that with the fact that for the Chinese speaking diaspora, there are no real other viable news source outside of the official channels. This is actually one of the reasons why the collapse of the press freedom and autonomy in Hong Kong is such a, you know, uh,
mm,
destructive force. Is that Hong Kong used to be that place where we can
mm,
interpret for the rest of the world news that were coming out from China.
mm,
And the collapse of the free press in Hong Kong means that we have lost another extremely important critical lens to
mm,
evaluate information and news. And so the results of that is very obvious when I sit down with officials of governments who regurgitate to my face propaganda points from the Chinese government without knowing that they're doing it. And I
mm.
think that should be alarming to everyone. And I think that the Russian propaganda, I think people are beginning to see how effective it still is.
Mm.
I think that needs to be put side by side with what the PRC has done and is doing.
Yeah, we've seen how effective the Chinese way of influencing public opinion was when Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, spoke out in China on human rights violations, and there was a huge pushback from left and right wing sources, but also kind of mainstream left wing sources that said you can't do that. Yeah, it's cultural unappropriate to point out to different culture human rights violations. You have to accept different ways of living. It's racist to try to push for Western values, although it's of course universal values, human rights, and so on. So it kind of resonated. It was picked up and then brought into the mainstream discussions, all those kind of talking points. But on the economic sphere again, because that is one of the best talking points that I think most of the Chinese propaganda brought through. There's no way to avoid China. We are a growing economic power. We have to deal with them. We have to cooperate with them. As you said, maybe the naivety as well that if we continue to trade with China, then they're going to change. That is some of the excuses, but I think most people know that that is probably not going to happen since Russia didn't change. But still, the argument is that we cannot avoid China. There's no way to avoid China. There's production, there's technology, and so on. So there's no way of going really de-risking or decoupling, whatever term you want to use, is not possible. What would you say to that argument?
Well, so I come at this questions from a long history of broken promises by the PRC, right? That, um, you know, I lived through the specific deal that were made between the PRC and Britain, and also registered in the UN for the fate of Hong Kong back in 1984, where they made all these agreements and then essentially ripped it up before the when it didn't serve the purpose anymore and when they wanted to. And same thing, right? That when the U.S. advocated back in way back for China's ascension into the World Trade Organizations, there was all this hopes and dreams that they were gonna do all these things to improve its political, human rights situation. None of that worked, and you see this in other iterations, right? The Olympic Committee has now awarded China twice the Olympic Games with all these guarantees and things that they said they were going to do, that in fact the games made it even more repressive because they were able to use it to sport wash and to use it to expand the security apparatus domestically as part of hosting this global event. So these are, I think there's a trail of broken promises that we can look into. But I think that to the point about economic, so number one, I think that we have to take seriously the idea that we can't actually trust who we're doing business with in the long term. I think that that needs to be in a fundamental, calculation in all economic relationships that we have with the PRC. Second is that I think increasingly people and businesses are seeing the risk of like two sets of different kind of risk. One is, what if what has happened in Russia happens to China, which is not impossible, and I'm not saying that something will happen next week, but if, let's say, China takes an aggressive action and some kind of a military action against Taiwan, company has to be prepared on what actually it would mean for them to walk out and be cut off from China. And that is going to be 100-fold worse than what happened walking away from Russia and having to economically isolate them. The second is elements of that risk has to do with doing business in Hong Kong and in China. Hong Kong has always been this global hub, but one of my friend and colleague, Jimmy Lai, is now in jail. He's a billionaire, runs a multinational corporation, was the publisher of the largest opposition newspaper in Hong Kong. His company was wiped out overnight. They froze his asset and then put him in jail. He has a UK passport. And the fact that this could happen to him and that this could happen to anyone like him ought to generate a lot of concerns of people operating. I think for years we've understood that this is part of the risk being in China. That if it comes to a legal dispute, you're probably not going to win. But this is now the way that business is done and the way that China's rule by law template is not just being used in the mainland anymore, it's being used in these kind of relationship globally, internationally. So I think that's another thing to pay a bit attention to. The third thing, some of the things very obvious. I think we now have a much more transparent and open debate about critical infrastructure, about the idea of how preposterous that if we can't invest in telecommunication and rail system in China, why would we allow China to invest and own our infrastructure in the same way? But even more than that is that, a few years back when the Huawei 5G discussion was really at its peak, there was a lot of, I think, learning and awareness that, oh, this might be something that would haunt us down the road. But I think that there is, sometimes a inconsistency, or at least somewhat of a willful blindness that we turn to say that, oh, yes, maybe we shouldn't have them build and own our whole 5G network, but if they just give us components for our rail system, maybe that would be okay. right. So we have this incomplete screening and vetting mechanism that says that telecommunication network is critical infrastructure, but
Mm,
the digital IP network for the rail system for Deutsche Bahn is not.
mm,
That doesn't make any sense. And I think that there needs to be a very much more open, transparent discussions. And that's actually a real example. I think I mentioned this yesterday.
mm,
Deutsche Bahn had awarded a 64 million euro contract to essentially use Huawei components in their digitalizing of the rail system.
mm,
And that, for me, is a most obvious examples of us essentially opening our doors and saying that come and take part and own part of our security infrastructure. And then, without really any kind of pushback and critical analysis about the risks that we know exist.
mm,
And the last point I would just make is that I think there's a lot of this talk recently about, decoupling, de-risking, or whatever the term that, I'm sure that German would come up with a unique term maybe themselves on describing it. But the truth that we have to acknowledge is that China and the PRC has been doing this themselves for a while now.
mm,
That they have actually been insulating themselves from these kind of risks over the last decades because they actually understand that they have to rely on domestic manufacturing, that they cannot risk being cut off from the technology manufacturing and innovation. Uh, People are like, well, they've been stealing intellectual properties and all these other things over the last few decades. So why do you think they've been so aggressive? It's because they know that they got to bring it back into the domestic borders
mm,
and actually do these things and rely only on their own domestic supply chains because they are and have already been de-risking, decoupling in a strategic way. And we just haven't actually caught on sufficiently enough yet. And so, while German companies are still trying to break into the market in China, still trying to get a piece of the manufacturing supply chain that is somehow in their mind cheaper or more affordable, China has been limiting what German company can produce in China or can export to China because they understand precisely that we don't want to rely on German companies to
mm,
manufacture anything that we would actually need. And so, people need to wake up to the fact that 54% of electrical vehicle today are made in China.
mm,
And we're not going to be um, operating in this kind of um, quid pro quo, reciprocity that we somehow dream is still the case, where we're somehow helping China develop, or that we are competitively, trading with them in a mutually beneficial way. China has already gotten ahead, and we are just catching up.
mm. So for the last point, I would ask you to repeat or outline the 2 or 3 main things that should be done now in Europe for dissidents, but also to counter the foreign interference. And I just want to point out, because I think a lot of the German audience doesn't know, or that, for example, the Czech Republic, a very small European state, has been very brave and put in place a lot of measures, and they still survived. So this is one of the big, myths, that if you do that, you're going down and everything will stop, your economy will stop. And it doesn't seem that way in the Czech Republic. They're still working, they're still living, and they're thriving even. So if you have the courage to address these foreign interferences, and they have done it not only towards China, but also towards Russia, it works. So what would be, in your opinion, the 2 or 3 main things that
Yeah.
have to be done now?
So I mean, just to summarize, I think that there, if I have to kind of come up with a summary, a wish list, um, I think that we have to proactively, aggressively counter foreign interference in the form of political interference, economic coercion, and this harassment and what we call transnational repression of diaspora and dissidents. And the way to do that is about making sure and aligning government agency from top to bottom to be able to know, to have training, to have adequate intel, to have coordination, to be able to respond from the local law enforcement all the way up to the Ministry of Justice, to Foreign Ministry, to the intelligence services, so that there is a seamless structure in place to share and respond to these acts, no matter how small or how isolated those incidents might be. So there needs to be what I just consider a infrastructure put in place that connects the diaspora dissident communities all the way to the intelligence services that have a proactive way of responding. And the result of that this is what we should see. We should see aggressive, open prosecution, arrests, and investigation of these crimes. We should see the media being very judicious and committed in terms of investigating and sharing and laying out these kind of incidents beyond the sensational cases of assassinations or poisoning. And that there is a diaspora community that is equipped to actually train and inform law enforcement and the government about what they're facing, and knowing that they have the rights and the capacity to report and respond to them. So that kind of robust infrastructure is what I think, and everybody has a role to play in that scenario. And that's what I'm hoping to look for and see. Because then what I hope is that it becomes clear to everyone that it's actually not just people like me that are being targeted. Yes, I wake up every day, and my colleagues in this work wake up every day facing, harassment of our family members, threats, from social media, like you say, accusations of, sexual harassment or financial impropriety. I mean, all of these kind of smearing that can happen. As it turns out, it doesn't just happen to us, as you said. My hope is that we create enough of a conversation and an infrastructure that people begin to actually see that they are actually targeted and that it actually has happened to them. And people who know that this has happened to them feel like they have a place to go to and actually talk about this openly and report, and that they are actually taken seriously. And I think that that's what I would hope in Europe would have. The second big aspect I would look at is that, and in some way, I'm hoping that Germany is coming to a point where the government is about to announce its own national security policy, its own China policy. There's going to be a government-to-government consultation with China at the end of June here. That I think that in at least even in the smallest way, I hope that Germany would be able to come out and say that we're not going to keep doing business as usual. Taking into account of all the things that we've learned, it's in light of the Ukraine invasion, in terms of Russia, in light of the interference by PRC on German soil, that there needs to be a clear break and clear acknowledgement that this is no longer business as usual. And I think that needs to start at the government level. I wish that more company who I know in the boardrooms and the CEO suites and the C-suites, they are already talking about how they would respond to a potential break from the from the PRC and from the Chinese market. They need to raise the alarm. Then we can really create a much more robust local domestic discussions about what we should be talking about. I take comfort, at least some slight comfort, in the debate about selling the Hamburg port terminal to a Chinese company last year. There was some debate within this coalition government, about Chancellor Scholz's visit with business executive to Beijing last year. There was an action taken last year to cap the guarantees of German investment in China. And all of these things I think are important, but we are inching maybe towards this break. And what I hope to see by the end of this month, and hopefully by the end of summer, and when there is actually an unveiling of the China policy, is that there's a clear acknowledgement that we have to break from the status quo we're not going to, it's unrealistic to say that we're going to separate completely and break away from China right now. But we also know that this is not going to be business as usual. And it requires the government to make that announcement. It requires the businesses to step up and say that the warning signs are there. And then we can really push for a robust domestic discussion so that regular everyday German is not getting their information from YouTubers paid by the Chinese government or from Chinese ambassador tweeting on a platform that no other Chinese person in the mainland can see. But we're actually having this debate about what is the national interest and what is the national security and what is the obligation to people and communities like mine that are living overseas that are actually speaking on behalf of the people in Hong Kong when they are not allowed to speak. We should get, if not more, equal exposure as the propagandists and the mouthpieces of the Chinese government in Germany than anybody else. And I think that that's what I would hope we could do. And again, those are very broad, but there are millions of pieces and opportunities under both of those topic and an umbrella that I hope that we continue to do. And I think that you raised some of the really interesting, important point about the lack of documentation and research and analysis about these vast operations that are being perpetrated by the Chinese government. I hope that you and others like you are taking that up, and I'm glad and honored to be a part of this conversation.
So thank you very much. We will put out a policy paper on that, a brief summary, and make it available before the end of June to decision makers. And we will continue to work on it to counter the foreign interference and try.
And thank you for everybody. And thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for everybody for joining. And I'm sorry that we started a little bit late because of some technical difficulty. I can actually now say for sure that it was not the PRC or the Iran or Russia. It was just me and my technical difficulty. And but I also want to thank Antia and the Axel Springer Freedom Foundation for bringing us together. And it's a new initiative that I'm very proud to be a part of. If you're in Berlin, come to the Axel Springer Plaza right here where the Pillar of Shame is located. It's going to be here until the 22nd of June. And but thank you so much, Rebecca. It's a joy and a privilege and an honor to talk with you. And these are very important subjects, and I'm so glad that we can spend this hour together.
Thank you. And we will go and visit the Pillar of Shame.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.